Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bradford seminar series. My name is Elke Weber, and I'm here to introduce our speaker today. Angel Xu is an assistant professor of public policy and the Environment, Ecology, and Energy program at the University of North Carolina. She previously held a joint appointment as assistant professor of environmental studies at the Yale and US College in Singapore and the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She holds a PhD in environmental policy from Yale University, an MPhil in environmental policy from the University of Cambridge, and a Bachelor of Science in Biology and BA in political science from Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dr. Xu is the founder and director of the Data-Driven EnviroLab, an interdisciplinary research group that innovates and applies quantitative approaches to pressing environmental issues. In late 2020, the lab issued a very thoughtful report on navigating the nuances of net zero targets. Dr. Xu's research explores the intersection of science and policy and the use of data-driven approaches to understand environmental sustainability, particularly in the areas of climate change and energy, urbanization and air quality. Her research projects apply large-scale data sets derived from satellite, remote sensing, and other spatially explicit sources to evaluate environmental policy performance. Focusing particularly on China and the Global South, Dr. Xu has provided expert testimony to the US-China Economic Security and Review Commission and is a member of the National Committee on US-China Relations and a Public Intellectual Program Fellow. In addition to publishing in academic journals, Dr. Xu has been committed to public outreach. She was a TED 2018 Age of Amazement speaker and an inaugural GRIST 50 leader. Today, she will talk to us about cities on the climate front lines, evaluating urban climate change and policy responses. Over to you, Angel.
Well, thank you so much, Elke, for the really kind and thorough introduction. And thanks so much to the C-PREE seminar series for inviting me today to talk about some of my research that's focused on cities and climate change. And so I was mentioning to the organizers before we started that I prepared way too many slides. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to talk about two of our large projects today. And so I'm going to try to be efficient about this, but luckily we have some time for Q&A at the end to dig deeper into anything that I may speed over today. Okay, so without further ado, I will share my screen and hopefully the technology gods will be on my side and allow for presentation mode. So I'm clicking the button and hopefully this means we will be seeing my slides in a second. Are we all good? I'm assuming if no one stops me, then it's okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to start with just some context for why I'm interested in cities at the forefront of climate change. And this is a figure that I like to start my lectures and my classes talking about the role of cities. So I can see this data that the urban population has surpassed that of the rural population. And so more people are living in cities than ever before. And this number is expected to increase to 65% by 2050. And so many scholars and many people have now labeled the time period that we currently exist in as the urban century. And so just some of these key stats, even though cities only occupy 2% of the global land area, they account for something around 70% of the global economy. And I've heard as much as 85% of global GDP. That means that they also consume over 60% of global energy and generate more than 70% of greenhouse gas emissions and 70% of global waste. And so in terms of their contribution to global environmental issues, and particularly climate change, it's outsized compared to the small percentage of land that they occupy, but increasingly becoming more important due to the fact that more and more people are migrating to urban areas and cities every day. And we're seeing urban expansion, particularly in areas of the global south. China and India, for example, will account for the majority of urbanization and urban growth in this next decade, as well as Africa. And at the same time, even though cities are growing, they are also becoming more at risk and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So many cities are located in coastal areas that are more vulnerable to sea level rise, to more extreme events such as hurricanes and tornadoes, tsunamis, for example. And so this figure gives a look at where some of the most vulnerable cities are located. And you can see those that are at extreme risk from climate change and vulnerability due to climate change impacts are overwhelmingly located in the global south. and in particular in areas like India, for example, Southeast Asia, where I just moved from. And so cities are increasingly more vulnerable to climate change. They're also becoming centers of inequality. And so much of the debate that we hear of rising wealth, for example, growth in wealth, has also resulted on the flip side in cities becoming increasingly centers of inequality and unequal opportunity and unequal growth. This is a photo that I'll show several series from Johnny Miller, who's a photographer, and he takes these incredible photos. This is not photoshopped, called Unequal Scenes. And this is a look at Mexico City, where you can see that just a small highway divides a much wealthier neighborhood on the left from a much more informal and less wealthy neighborhood on the right. And we see these scenes all over the world in cities across the globe. And this is another look at Mexico City, where you can see an informal soccer pitch on the left stands in stark relief to this much wealthier neighborhood on the right, where you have these really nice tennis courts and you've got soccer pitches that are really nice. And so this is another reason why I'm interested in cities, and an increasingly important aspect of cities' rise and their contribution and their to both addressing climate change and also the impacts that they're increasingly suffering. At the same time as cities are rising in importance, they are also taking on an increasing share of global leadership when it comes to climate change. Our research has documented more than 10,000 cities across the globe that are participating in transnational climate change initiatives. And so these are networks that cities are connecting with other cities, often across national boundaries, globally, to tackle challenges of climate change. So committing to emissions reduction targets, sharing ideas and capacity building, technology, for example, best practices. And at the same time, and as part of this larger trend, we're seeing cities also participate in global governance of climate change. And so in 2015, alongside the Paris climate negotiations, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo here on the left and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg on the right hosted a Cities for Climate Summit in parallel to the national government discussions that were happening in Paris. And they convened around 400 city and state and regional mayors and governors to come together to talk about their contributions to climate change and how they could address and tackle the problem alongside national governments. And so this was quite exciting to see as part of the formal discussions of Paris, the Paris Accord, and actually subnational governments and the recognition that climate action needs to happen at all levels became formally enshrined in the Paris Agreement itself. And so we've been documenting the rise of cities and also non-state or corporate private actors in global climate governance since the Paris Agreement. And so this is some of the data that we featured as part of the UN Environment Emissions Gap report. There was a special section on subnational and non-state actors in 2018. And you can see here on the left that just in a short period of time between 2015 and 2017, the number of actors that are pledging and signing up and participating in global governance has increased. So we had 7,000 documented actors in 2015. That increased to close to 7,400 actors in 2017. And then the latest database that we just put together and published as part of scientific data recorded more than 10,000 actors. And the number just keeps growing every single day. And not only are the number of individual climate policy actors increasing, they're also increasing in terms of the initiatives that they're collaborating and cooperating within. And so that's the figure here on the right. You can see in the early 2000s, there were just a few of these international cooperative initiatives, but then over time, particularly punctuated by key events like the COP in Copenhagen, for example, in 2009, and then the COP21 in Paris, for example, saw a huge spike in the number of climate initiatives that have been rising. And many of these climate initiatives, you may ask, what does that look like? Specifically, what does that mean? They could be, for example, focused on a particular geographic location, like the United States Climate Alliance, which brings together states in the US that are pledging emissions reduction targets, taking on renewable energy goals, for example. Or they could be more global in nature, like the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which at the last count has more than 11,000 actors that are participating. There's also efforts like CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, which encourages cities and states and regional governments to disclose their annual emissions, their climate risks, what actions they're taking on mitigation and adaptation, for example, and also publishing their baseline emission inventories and other emissions data to track how they're progressing on their climate targets. And then just last June, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat launched the Race to Zero campaign, which actively galvanizes and encourages cities and other company actors to pledge decarbonization goals in order to align with the IPCC's 1.5 special report and the science that says that we need to decarbonize by mid-century in order to keep that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal within reach. So this is giving you a little bit of the context and what has been happening the last 5 years that just demonstrates the growth and the momentum that these cities have been taking in order to participate on a more global scale with respect to climate and overall environmental governance. And so what this is showing is a shift in conventional environmental governance. Whereas previously, environmental and climate governance has really been the purview of nation states and has really focused on national government actors as the main source of policy. And so this is just a look at the UN system. I took this picture outside of Geneva. And actually, this was not my photo, this is somebody else's, but I have a similar picture outside of Geneva at the UN. And so there have been scholars of global environmental governance, like Eleanor Ostrom, for example, that have challenged the notion that this top-down conventional mode of environment or climate governance is actually effective, or the mode that we should be continuing to follow moving forward, just given the fact that the picture is actually a lot more diverse and it's not just singularly comprised of national governments. And so she's put forth theories of this notion of polycentric climate governance. And so the notion that there are multiple centers of action and climate actors. And then Bob Cohan and David Victor have discussed regime complexes and the fact that the climate governance landscape can be a diverse landscape and picture of different instruments or smaller groups of actors working in multilateral clubs, for example. And then there are also different labels that have been applied, such as multi-level governance, networked governance, or transnational climate governance, to depict and describe the emergence of new actors that are now participating in climate change governance, as opposed to this traditional conventional theory of top-down governance that the Kyoto Protocol, for example, was based on. And so why am I interested, and what are some of the theories that have been put forth for the role of subnational actors within global climate governance? And so a few scholars like Matt Hoffman, for example, at the University of Toronto, has talked about the ability of subnational actors to be more flexible and innovative and to experiment with climate policies that might be too challenging to implement at the national scale. Ken Abbott has talked about how with this new polycentric, multi-level networked governance system, national governments and the UNFCCC, for example, international government organizations might play more of an orchestration role to coordinate this increasingly diverse landscape of climate actors. Sandra Chan has put forth the notion that subnational actors can actually catalyze more climate actors. And Tom Hale has written a piece that talks about now the Paris Agreement has ushered in this catalytic and facilitative mode of climate governance that encourages this multitude of actors to all participate. And then the part where a lot of my work has fit in and the theory that I've been trying to put forth and to lend credibility to is the fact that I believe that these non-state and subnational climate actors can actually have a direct effect. They can directly lead to mitigation on top of national government actors. So they can exceed or go beyond the ambition of national government policies and actually directly lead to reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And what led me to this particular theory is looking at the current emissions landscape and the emissions gap report. We can clearly see that national government policy efforts, which are in blue here, are insufficient to help us contain global temperature rise within 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is the green and the blue scenario here in this figure. And so the UNFCCC and the IPCC have evaluated that current national policy efforts, the NDCs or the Paris Agreement pledges, are going to lead us to a median 3.6 degree warming scenario in 2100. And so it's clearly insufficient. And so what I'm particularly interested in considering is whether or not this momentum and this groundswell of subnational and non-state climate actors can actually help to reduce this emissions gap and lead us closer to our emissions goals. And so that's the theory for why I'm interested in cities and their role as climate policy actors. And so I want to talk about two projects where we're testing some of these theories given this context. And so the first project that I want to speak about today is our global climate action of cities and companies and regional governments. And some of the questions that we've been asking as part of this project is, first of all, how are cities responding to climate mitigation? What are they committing to, and what is the potential impact of their policies? And so this is testing the direct effect theory. And then secondly, how do we actually gauge their performance and what factors shape it? And so this has been a pretty critical question in the last several years, particularly as we've been moving from the phase of just gauging the potential and measuring commitments to commit and actually wanting to consider whether or not these actors are following through on their pledges. And then the second piece, I want to talk about a project where we've been using high resolution satellite data to answer the question whether cities are implementing policies equally and whether or not they're benefiting all. So getting to that question of inequality. Okay, so going to the first project. In our Global Climate Action Project, we have been spending the last few years developing a global database, the most comprehensive global database of city, state and regional government, and corporate climate action. So some of the questions that we've been asking are, first of all, who is taking climate action? Where are they located? And are these large companies? Are they the Coca-Colas and the Pepsis? Or are they mom and pop cement factories, for example, that are taking action? And then also, how are they taking action? What strategies are they implementing to address climate change? And so to answer the first question, who is taking climate action? One of the first papers that we published on this topic was evaluating a UN portal that was launched in 2014 at the Lima Conference of Parties that was a first effort to showcase all of these different actors and the types of climate action that were being taken. And so I got a call from the UNFCCC Secretariat and the Paris government in the lead up in the summer months leading up to the Paris negotiations. And they said, we are worried that the Paris negotiations are going to fail and that governments will not be able to agree. So we have this NASCA portal and we want to be able to analyze it and provide data and analytics and statistics so that in case the Paris Agreement doesn't come through, we can still show the broad base of support for climate action amongst all of these private and non-state actors. And so that was the first charge. And so what we did was we reverse engineered that website and we matched that with data from Bloomberg's revenue portal, for example, from databases that had city level population and emissions. And we were able to actually analyze the global landscape of who's taking climate action. So in the end of 2015, what we found is that there were more than 7,000 actors that were taking climate action. And in terms of cities, around 2,000 of them were pledging their own climate actions, accounting for about 7% of the global population. And you can see the themes in which they were pledging climate action. Overwhelmingly, 85% of these actions were focused on emissions reductions. And so very clearly, you can start to take a look at this picture and notice some gaps. So for example, there's no mention here of climate change adaptation or resilience or vulnerability. Overwhelmingly, the actions focus at this time on emissions reductions and climate change mitigation. And you can see there are differences between cities, regional governments, and companies. Companies, for example, have a tendency to focus on energy efficiency as being a main strategy. We were also able to identify where action was happening and where action was not happening. And so you can see in red major geographic gaps in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, for example, where we could not find any recorded climate action. And so this seemed to suggest that much of the activity was happening in the global north, particularly in Europe, for example, where we found 74% of cities reporting were located there. And so that seemed to suggest that still this non-state, bottom-up, groundswell climate action agenda was still largely being driven by actors in the global north. And then we're also able to identify sectoral gaps. So in terms of the 90 largest companies that are responsible for around 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions historically, which actors are actually signed up to take climate action and which aren't. And so you can see some of these oil and gas companies like Peabody Energy, which I believe is no longer in business, and other Saudi Aramco, for example, not pledging any type of climate action. So this kind of data allowed us to really provide a first landscape analysis and provide statistics and data to understand the global extent of who's taking action, where, and where action is not happening. And then to answer the second question, how are they taking action? And so going back to the name of my research group, which is the Data-Driven Environmental Policy Lab, or the Data-Driven Lab, one of the areas in which we've been interested in pushing methodological innovation and development is trying to understand the role of machine learning techniques and utilizing textual data as sources of information, because we know that numbers are not easy to come by, and even with quantitative data, it can be pretty limiting in terms of analysis. And so we've been utilizing the strategies and strategy documents, policy documents that these actors have been publishing, and developing large-scale corpora to then apply these machine learning algorithms and techniques to deduce themes and strategies that are common or uncommon to different actors. And so we published a paper recently in January that looks at some of these strategies. And so one of the things that's striking about these different strategies that subnational actors are taking is that you can see some of the themes that they're focused on include consumption and looking at waste and public transit, sustainable transportation, looking at building efficiency, for example. And so the city actions and the likelihood of policy documents reflecting one of these key topics that we have on the x-axis are in red. And then for the other actors, companies are in blue, the regional governments are in dark blue, and the national government actors, so we also evaluated the NDCs, are in light blue. And you can see that while national governments, primarily least developed and developing countries, have a much more likelihood of mentioning climate change adaptation, cities and companies are much less predicted to have those mentions and clear strategies that focus on climate change adaptation. And we can take a closer look at the frequency with which different climate actors talk about their climate strategies. So for cities, for example, we found a lot of mentions of public participation and stakeholder engagement being really key to mobilize climate change action. Or in terms of residential buildings and in private and commercial building sector, there was a lot of activity focused there. And then you can see differences. So for companies on the right in blue, there was a lot more discussion about estimating annual carbon emission savings and the monetary investments and the benefits that are derived from these different climate actions. And over the course of different actions lifetimes, how much would they save? And so there's a lot more focused on monetary benefits. And so these are some of the types of themes and and strategies that we could analyze as part of this analysis. And then we can also take a look at understanding how connected these different climate actions are and whether or not we saw greater similarities between actors that are operating within similar geographic regions. And you can see here in red this huge cluster of cities within Europe that tend to be really similar to other cities within Europe taking climate actions. And there's a lot less similarity when you move outside of Europe. Although companies between North America and Europe, you can see these lines in blue, tend to be quite, have some close connections. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but I'm kind of highlighting that area. And then also we see some connections between companies in East Asia and Japan, for example, in Europe. And so this is quite interesting. And I think it makes a lot of sense that cities located in the same area would borrow ideas from each other. They might face similar climate change challenges. And then also through these networks, such as the European Covenant of Mayors, for example, they often will provide templates or assistance in capacity building and helping cities identify good practices for climate change policies and also allow for conventions and sharing of different climate strategies. And so that's something we see reflected in the textual data. Another trend that I just want to briefly mention where we're coming out with some new research is actually this trend of net zero cities. So Elke mentioned that we released a few reports last fall in collaboration with the New Climate Institute, which is based in Germany, looking at this rise of more and more cities pledging decarbonization goals. And so now we're starting to look at those plans and to understand how cities are planning on meeting those really ambitious targets. And we're already seeing some differences between cities that are located in developed countries versus those in developing countries. And so far more developed country cities are pledging net zero targets that you can see here in red. We have around 277 strategies that we considered where they actually published plans for how they plan on reaching net zero. And then in blue, there are far fewer developing country cities that have pledged action. But already we're seeing differences in how they're articulating these strategies. So for example, developing country cities are focusing on waste and adaptation, for example. They're also looking at local and community actions more frequently, and also the role of water. Whereas developed countries are talking about consumption and talking about the need for leadership and looking at buildings, for example, and heating. So some differences in how we're seeing net zero cities take climate action. We're also doing some more inferential modeling to try to understand what determines net zero ambitions, and are there certain ways in which actors are articulating strategies that determines their ambition for net zero. And so what we are finding so far is that cities that tend to be more specific in their climate plans, so they're actually identifying quantitative targets, emissions reductions, percentage, for example, that's the number 3 terminology here on this left-hand plot. And they're referring to technology, for example, so looking at boilers, life cycle of emissions, for example, they tend to be more correlated with cities that have pledged ambitious net zero plans as opposed to those who are not. And then we can look at trade-offs between different topics that cities that are pledging net zero are also pledging. So for example, cities that are talking about land use, for example, may be doing that at expense of referring to energy-related topics. So this is just giving you a preview of some of the work that's coming out shortly, diving deeper into net zero strategies, because it is such a hot topic that is now emerging on the policy stage. Okay, so that's the first 2 questions. And then going into the direct effect piece, looking at all these strategies and seeing the tens, thousands or something cities that are pledging in these networks, and they're saying that they're doing X, Y, and Z, they want to decarbonize. A major question that we've been asking as part of this research is, well, does it actually have an effect? Is it actually helping to narrow that emissions gap that we looked at? So my research group and I have been working on developing methods the last few years to actually quantify and to consider the overlaps between subnational government climate actions, corporate climate actions, and national government actions. And so this has been a huge methodological and modeling exercise over the last few years. And it's quite interesting because when I first started to do this quantification and develop this data, there was a lot of resistance against doing this. And so a lot of national government actors, I would go to the UN meetings and talk about this research and try to get their feedback on the methods. And they would immediately say, so this is the national government perspective, they would immediately say, well, wait a second, why are you doing this? And why are you trying to disentangle the overlaps and to try to figure out if there's double counting? This doesn't matter. From a policy perspective, all that really matters is the demonstration piece and the fact that these cities and these companies are just demonstrating support for national government actors. Because of course, all of their emission reduction targets and efforts are in service of the national pledges and the Paris NDCs. And I said, okay, well, I understand that perspective, but I'm telling you, I'm working with the subnational networks and the corporations, and they want to get credit for the additional leadership that they're taking. And they really want to, from the reputational perspective and benefits, they want to be given extra credit for going beyond national government efforts. And so we're trying to quantify that additionality. And so it's been really interesting to kind of see the debate oscillate and the resistance initially against the formal recognition of non-state actors as part of the Paris Agreement to now they're just being seen a lot more emphasis and acceptance and also I think excitement around what national governments can, how they can engage better with subnational and non-state actors. And so what we found, we've published 2 versions of this report now. The first one was launched at the 2018 Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco that was hosted by then Governor of California, Jerry Brown. Bloomberg was also involved, and it brought together thousands of non-state and subnational actors to talk about their efforts on climate change. So it really was a follow-on from that 2015 Paris sideline concurrent COP effort. And so I'm trying to circle on this little orange bar here with the 1 above it. So what we found is that 6,000 of the subnational climate change pledges in addition to 1,500 corporate actions, can lead to an additional 1 to 2 gigatons on top of what national governments have pledged in 2030. So it doesn't seem like it's very exciting, just this tiny little bar, but it's taken a lot of work and a lot of methodological development, a lot of data set development, and a lot of peer review to actually get to this one particular number, to actually show with credibility and robustness that these actions actually are leading to a direct reduction on global greenhouse gas emissions on top of what national governments have pledged. So it doesn't seem like it's very exciting, but I'm very excited about it. And this has been able to provide the first quantitative evidence that these subnational actions are not a fluke. And so it was actually really interesting in class last week. In my climate science and policy class, I was teaching about multi-level climate governance. And so I reread Eleanor Ostrom's 2010 paper talking about polycentric governance. And she said something about, oh, for this top-down conventional theory, there is no empirical evidence that it actually works. And then here we finally do have this empirical evidence of the contrary, that actually the polycentric universe of climate action can have a direct effect. And so there's quite a lot of potential here. And then when we look in specific national government context, we can see that non-state and subnational actors can actually have a huge impact. So we developed this figure and this analysis during the Trump administration, which had withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and had actually withdrawn and rolled back a lot of climate policies. And what we show here in this orange bar is that states and cities and companies taking climate action can actually make up half of the US's original NDC and get the US back on track towards meeting the Paris Agreement pledge that was originally made in 2014. And so this is quite exciting in these contexts. But one of the caveats that we make in this analysis is that what we're quantifying here is really potential. And so we assume that every one of those 6,000 city actors, every one of those 1,500 corporate actors follows through on their commitment, and there's no rollback or any type of reversal of climate policies elsewhere. So that's a huge assumption to be made. And so as part of this research, some of the feedback that I've received over the last few years is, well, how do we know that these actors are actually following through? And can you actually collect emissions data to track progress against these targets? Now, that's a much harder task because unfortunately, many of these actors, they don't actually follow through and produce transparency and data that would actually allow us to evaluate that question. And that's part of the problem. It's very difficult and time consuming. So my first job out of grad school was actually working at the World Resources Institute on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative. And we were developing standards and tools to quantify greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And I was training companies and governments on how to develop their inventories. And it's mind-boggling that more than 15 years later, since I had that job, there has been no innovation in how we expect these actors to actually measure and account for the greenhouse gas emissions. And so it wasn't surprising to me in speaking and working with my collaborators, and they come back and they say, Angel, you have to get us more data. And I say, well, I can't. I'm limited by what city governments can report and what they make publicly available. I can't just make up numbers for these actors. And so we had to start somewhere. And so this past August, we published a paper in Nature Climate Change that evaluated 1,000 European cities that have reported progress data to the European Covenant for Mayors and Climate and Energy. So that initiative has about 9,000 actors that are participating, and only about a tenth of them actually produce data. So around 1,000 of them actually report data. And so we use that data along with their strategy documents to understand, well, what are the determinants that can predict whether or not a city within the EU is on track to meet their emissions reduction goal, which is more ambitious. They have to be more ambitious than the EU target. And so what we found is that here on the left in the map, about 61% of cities are actually on track within the EU to meet their 2020 emissions reduction target. So that's actually reassuring because we haven't had a lot of evidence to say otherwise. And so that's quite reassuring. So many of the cities, the majority of the cities are on track. And of course, there are regional differences and country level differences. But you can see even in red, there are a number of cities that are actually going in the opposite direction and are not on track. And then over here on right, I have these distributions that show, according to per capita emissions, baseline emissions, for example, different determinants that we included in our statistical model that could show us what factors can help determine performance. And so one of the key findings is that, first of all, cities with higher baseline emissions per capita tend to be those on track, and that makes a lot of sense. If you have higher emissions and you have more room to actually implement policies to reduce those emissions. And one of the other predictors, as we found at the third panel on the right, is that national emissions trends. So if you're located within a country that's also achieving your emissions reductions, that also has an influence on whether or not you're able to meet your target. One of the pieces that we found actually to not be a predictor was actually the ambition of the emissions reduction target. So those cities that tended to be more ambitious, so pledging these decarbonization goals, for example, tended to not be on track. And those that had more modest emissions reduction target actually tended to be more on track and in line with achieving their goals. So that was something that was quite interesting. And so this is, again, showing some of that, those outputs. And then we found, in terms of strategies, those actors that were pledging energy efficiency and talked about energy efficiency as being a core action were those that tended to also be associated with performance. And so this paper is available, and if you're not able to access it, feel free to email me for a copy. So this is the largest scale study that is actually looking at performance. So I think we can have reasonable assurance that cities are achieving their goal. But one of the things that we're doing now, we're finishing up the results for this as we speak. And so I'm about to meet with my team after this presentation to try to finalize this and get this submitted to a journal. But we're now using machine learning and AI to actually predict performance. So given a set of predictors such as fossil fuel-based CO2 emissions, heating degree days, population, other predictors, for example, can we feed that based on using the European data as a training data set to then predict individual cities' performance trajectory and whether or not they are on track to achieving their emissions reduction target. And so you can see here on the right that actually our model is getting pretty reasonable results, or pretty high correlation between our test data on the x-axis and the predicted emissions data on the y-axis. And some of the top predictors that we're finding to be significant in the model include things like, again, that country level emissions, population, whether or not they've pledged a reduction target, fossil fuel-based CO2 emissions, for example. And so I think that this is pointing to some of the ways in which we're going to need to address these data gaps in the future, is how can we use technology and digital solutions, which is another prong of my own research agenda. But I think we're going to have to be going into this direction, because simply we can't keep doing things the way we have been for the last 20 years and expecting a result. The emissions inventory and reported data picture is just not improving year after year. And so we have to think about how we can use digital technologies and next generation data to solve the problem. So I'm really excited about this research and would love your feedback on it in the future. Okay, so I know I only have about 5 minutes now to talk about the second project, but we'll have more time to engage during. So I just wanted to briefly talk about how we are answering this question of, okay, so these policies are being implemented, cities are pledging, but are they benefiting everybody within an urban area equally? Because we know that people do not live unidimensionally within a city. And there are goals like the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which charges cities to be sustainable and inclusive, but haven't provided spatially explicit data to evaluate progress against those targets. And so it's mind-boggling to me that all of these indicators, if you look at all these city indices, they have one number that is supposed to represent the picture on the ground for all citizens. But I just showed you these unequal scene project. This is in Johannesburg, for example, and you can see these wealthy neighborhoods on the right, and golf courses are juxtaposed right next to informal settlements. And yet the indicators seem to suggest that every citizen has the same access to green space and clean air and shelter from urban heat, for example. So that was really the main goal of this index, is through these 5 dimensions, can we use satellite remote sensing, crowdsourced data through OpenStreetMap, for example, to measure on a neighborhood by neighborhood scale whether or not cities are meeting this charge. And so we include now 165 cities, but this list is growing every day. And for cities around the world, we provide a dashboard that allows them to investigate neighborhood by neighborhood a indicator of air quality, urban heat island, tree cover, for example, and how that particular neighborhood compares to the neighborhood average on a whole. So that's the spiderweb plot here on the right. And some of the results are quite shocking. So this is Los Angeles in the United States, for example. And on the left, you have income per capita. The darkest green numbers have income per capita of over 100,000 US dollars per person, where the light blue neighborhoods in this image have much less income per person, so only about a third of the amount of income. And then on the right, you can see the same image in the same neighborhoods, and this is tree cover per capita. And so those much wealthier neighborhoods have much higher levels of access to green space and to tree cover. And so this dark green neighborhood actually has a 70% coverage of green space, but then the same neighborhoods that only had a third of the income per capita only have 5%. So huge disparities that you can see even within cities in terms of access to environmental amenities. And as we know, in terms of tree cover and green space, trees provide evaporative cooling and shade, and so that helps to provide shelter from urban heat island effects, for example, and also helps to filter out harmful air pollution. Green spaces are known to foster social cohesion and promote public safety, for example. And so not only are people at a disadvantage of lack of access to green space, they're also more vulnerable to environmental health impacts, such as respiratory distress, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. And so these types of disparities, we're using data to systematically measure and to evaluate. And then collaborating with Glenn Sheriff at Arizona State University, we've developed a method that applies the idea of a Gini coefficient or Lorenz curves to then be able to summarize and to quantify inequalities in exposure. And so what we can do taking this concept is, if we think about this dotted line here as a line of perfect equality. So this would mean that a particular environmental benefit or burden is equally distributed amongst the entire population. If it's below that line, then the burden is placed on wealthier populations. If it's above, then that burden is placed on poorer populations. And so we can summarize these inequalities in a metric that we call the environmental concentration index. And it's calculated very much like you would a Gini coefficient, but for environmental goods and harms. And so what we found here, for example, this is the distribution of urban heat island intensity over an urban area. And so there are some probably predicted or anticipated results. Like Johannesburg, for example, you can see income in yellow, incredibly unequally distributed. So very far from that line of perfect equality. And then that line being above that dotted line suggests that urban heat island is disproportionately disadvantaging poorer populations. But one of the more striking findings here is Copenhagen. So Copenhagen, you can see income is relatively evenly distributed, but they are still also burdening poor populations with higher exposure to urban heat island. And so when I presented these results in Europe at the World Health Organization in the early phases of this project, some of the European policymakers were completely shocked, because they're used to Copenhagen being lauded as this environmental leader, sustainability beacon, and here they are still having a lot of work to do to making sure that those sustainability benefits are actually distributed equally. We can summarize in this 4x4 matrix or 2x2 matrix, this 4-quadrant plot, where different cities are located, whether or not they're actually meeting this charge of Sustainable Development Goal 11. I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, but all of this data and the reports are available on our website. And so what we can find from summarizing and placing all the cities on this quadrant here is that the majority of cities are located on the left, where they are disproportionately burdening the poor with environmental burdens. And so this was a shocking finding for me to find that actually cities are not meeting the charge of Sustainable Development Goal 11 and are not providing these benefits equally to all. And then we've extended this analysis, and this is the last paper that I'll present so that we can get to Q&A, is actually trying to understand, because the UESI in this particular analysis, we could only find data consistent for one dimension of equality, and that was income. But as we know, equity and social inclusion is multidimensional and includes many more facets, gender, race, for example, education, and a host of other indicators that we're not able to quantify consistently for every city that we include. So we wanted to drill down more into the US context. And so here's a New York Times article that talked about how decades of racist housing policy, redlining, for example, which gave preferential or did not give lending, or just, I guess, actively discriminated against Black and poor populations from housing loans. And so kind of relegated them to certain parts of the city that were less desirable. So whether or not these particular cases are just anecdotes or are they actually widespread across the United States. And so what we did using satellite data, and I'll just skip over this, using satellite data is we developed a data explorer using Google Earth Engine to evaluate for every single one of the 497 urban areas in the United States, how surface urban heat island intensity varies according to racial and ethnic demographic groups and also income. And the results were also equally shocking. So this research I presented at the AGU in December, and it should be published any day now. I'm just waiting to get the proofs. But what we found is that there are major systematic patterns of disparity in urban heat island exposure. So in most major US cities, populations in red are exposed to higher urban heat island intensity than populations in blue. So you can see that people of color are on average exposed to higher levels of urban heat by a full degree Celsius, actually more than their white counterparts. And the same goes for people living below poverty. And we didn't see as many effects in terms of age, which is another risk factor, and also more vulnerable elderly populations to urban heat is a serious concern in many cities. And so looking at this data across a map in the United States, what we found is that in 97% of major US cities, they are exposing minority populations to higher urban heat island intensity than their white counterparts. And the same goes to populations that are living below poverty. So 94% of major cities are exposing poor populations to higher urban heat intensity. And that the exposure for populations of color and below poverty are roughly equal. And so regardless of being below poverty or being a community of color, the likelihood of you being exposed to higher urban heat island is significantly worse than if you were in the other group. And so that's a pretty striking finding that just shows that there's systematic evidence of environmental racism going on in the United States. And so just very quickly, we can see in my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, for example, the patterns of exposure vary quite a lot. So the hottest areas in red and orange of Greenville, South Carolina tend to be coincident with those who are living below poverty, and also the percentage of Black population living in those census tracts are much higher. But then in Baltimore, for example, you can see that the percentage of Black population is more distributed around the urban core, as well as those who are living below poverty. So the patterns are actually quite different by city. Okay, so I know that I've gone over by about 4 minutes. And so I just want to give a teaser to, and I did preface some of the directions in which we're heading. So we have a National Science National Science Foundation funded project. It's a mouthful, looking at next generation tools and digital technologies to help improve the world of climate action and data tracking. We also just recently received a 2.5 million euro grant from the IKEA Foundation to look at the full value chain of subnational climate actions and ambitions. So how do they interact with national governments, and within the Paris Agreement's 5-year review cycles help to ratchet up and enhance the ambition of those Paris pledges. And and so I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the exciting pieces of research, and the next generation piece was really exciting because we just got funded by this art auction, this NFT, which I just found is a non-fungible token art auction that raised 6.6 million for this research, which was quite exciting. And so we have a lot of really exciting things ahead. And I just saw Elke hopped on, which I asked her to do to cut me off. And so I look forward to your questions in the remaining 10 minutes that we have. And here's all my contact information. So I really look forward to your follow-up. So thank you so much to the program for inviting me. And I'll turn it back to Elke.
Thank you so much, Angel, for this very, very rich presentation. Audience members, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A, and then I will call on you to ask the question. We will unmute you. So let's start with Marty Frank, who posed his first question.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. My question was asking about the ability of those of us on the call to access some of the data that Angel presented. I am a consultant, and I'm actually working with a US city right now to host a collaborative process with industry to create a climate change policy. Yeah, and so many of the things that you are working on would be very helpful to us in the kind of practical sense of operationalizing this work. And so in my question, I provided a couple examples of things. The policy library of understanding what policy options are out there, what cities are doing to give us ideas, the benefits that businesses see from their perspective to help us build the case. And then also the data you presented at the very beginning about how important cities are to this work. A lot of industry wants to push this off into the future or push it up as a way of delaying their having to make these changes. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. And I'm so excited that you're working directly with the city, because this is exactly what we need, is more of this really very localized adaptation of these climate policies, because that's where the change is really happening. And it's not an easy data landscape. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we've been spending so much time the last few years to try to make this data more accessible. And so much of the data is publicly available. And so we have a link on our website, a menu option that says data and software. And so we have links to a lot of these data sets. But if there's something that you're interested in that is not currently on our website, feel free to drop me a message, and happy to work with you. So yeah, I mean, CDP, for example, on data.cdp.net, they have all of the city disclosure data. And so you can access the full data set, and they do it on an annual basis. And they have about 800 cities all over the world that are disclosing to CDP, and they do provide information about what strategies they're taking, their emissions reduction targets, and if they are developing their emissions inventories, they do provide that. The only challenge is that it's not the easiest to use. It's quite unwieldy, and so we have to do a lot of data processing and a lot of cleaning. And yeah, I mean, it is challenging, because as a third-party user, I'm often limited in what I can republish. And so, I mean, there are attempts, like, for example, the UNFCCC, their Global Climate Action Portal, they're planning for a major overhaul and an update. And so I've seen mock-ups of it. And so pretty soon in the coming months, and certainly before COP26, in Glasgow in November, they're going to be updating the website, and they want to make the data more accessible so that you can go country by country, for example, or look at a specific city and look at all the different actions that they're taking and their progress along those targets, and whether or not they've made a net zero pledge, for example. So there are plans to try to make this data more accessible, but yeah, it's really, really challenging. It's not easy. And I spent a lot of time working with students to scrape the data and then try to put it in a harmonized data set. And so that's how we end up doing our analysis, because there's not just like one-stop shop that you can go to get all of this data. But yeah, I'm happy to discuss this in further detail with you and to learn more about what you're doing with your city.
Great. Our next question was from Nick Choquette-Levy.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks for a very thought-provoking talk. My question was on the difference between consumption and production-based accounting when you're evaluating cities' emissions performance. For example, one could argue that because in cities we consume a lot of food, that cities have some responsibility to reduce or to help reduce agricultural emissions. How is that typically accounted for in cities' emissions targets? And is that something that you pay attention to when you kind of quantify how much, more over like the Paris targets a city is contributing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And right now, it's not really being accounted for in cities' targets or their inventories. So we just finished the latest update of our database, and I can say less than 100 cities out of the 10,000 in our database actually report scope 3 or other indirect consumption-based emissions. And that's incredibly disappointing if you think about the growing role of cities and global footprints, and the fact that cities are very much starting to export and leak emissions into other territories and other spaces. And so that's a huge, huge gap that needs to be rectified. And so that's another piece of research I didn't get a chance to mention that our next round of this IKEA funded project is also going to look at, because of course, IKEA as a furniture and homewares store, I mean, they're really interested in understanding the full life cycle and being able to identify opportunities and areas of risk within their whole supply and value chain of where they may have exposure to greater climate risk. And so this is the same thing for cities as well. And so this is an area that we're actively developing research and methods and evaluation on. And so in this coming year, this is going to be a huge area where we're going to need to be developing better data and tools, because there just is very little information regarding these Scope 3 consumption-based emissions. And it's really hard. I mean, less than 100 cities. I mean, that's really, I mean, that's better than it was 2 years ago, but it's still really, really difficult, because then it involves a lot more coordination with folks outside of the supply chain. So it kind of relies on everybody doing their part and providing emissions information, and that simply is not happening. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the role of digital solutions and technology to help us get there and to generate the types of radical transformation and transparency that we need to be able to develop these types of estimates. But that's a great question.
Okay, we have a question from Elie Bouzid.
Hi, Angel, thank you very much for this very nice talk. I really loved the last part about the basically correlation between UHI and various socioeconomic factors, something we've been kind of suspecting, but you showed it nicely. So I have two questions on this. First, the UHI data, was it surface temperature derived from satellites? Yep.
That's right. Yep.
Yep. My second question, have you tried to dig a little bit to see what is the physical difference of, the urban areas that, where more minorities live versus richer or what, more white people? Is it tree cover? Is it population density? What is it that might be driving these differences?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, thank you. So I've read some of your papers as well. So thank you for your contributions. So yeah, in terms of some of the factors, so yes, first of all, it is surface urban heat island intensity. And so then a lot of, there's been a lot of debate recently in terms of these UHI measurements, whether or not it's actually a good indicator, right, of and measure of exposure. And we should be looking at, for example, air measurements, but of course, that data is not widely available. And so we have to rely on surface urban heat island intensity. And so we have looked at NDVI, for example, greenness as well. And so we have seen that there is a correlation between exposure or the lower surface urban heat island intensity and greater NDVI. So greenness obviously is a huge factor. And then we've looked at impervious, built environment, for example, NDBI as well, normalized difference built index is another one, looking at impervious surface. But yeah, I think that this is an area that also we could be doing a lot more detailed analysis. And yeah, so we have two papers that we published, and I'm happy to send them to you. One that looks at some of these factors, and so mainly NDBI, the impervious index, the built index, and then also NDVI as factors. And so we see, yeah, I think what you would expect in terms of with greener areas, you have less surface urban heat island intensity. And then with more impervious surface, obviously there's more. And yeah, but I mean, it's still pretty coarse. And so I think that definitely there would be a lot more space to dig deeper into some of these factors. And so, yeah, like Hoffman, for example, has looked at redlining and looked at 108 cities in that particular study. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a next phase that we're also interested in diving more. And now, with satellite data improving, we might be able to even get even more granular at the census block level, for example, instead of just a census tract. But yeah, some of this data is challenging to really get to, and it becomes like a processing issue. So I think that in the coming months that we'll be able to get much more details on some of the drivers of these differences.
Let me take my privilege and ask you perhaps the last question. You talked about cities as non-state actors, but you've also looked at companies in great detail. And you mentioned a couple of things that use different strategies, energy efficiency more than cities. Mm-hmm. In general, can you give us a summary of what your take is on company action in the climate space? Is it in good faith, and how can it be encouraged?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because it reminds me of my lesson last Tuesday. And I was asking my students the same thing. It's, you look at the data and you have large corporations, 2/3 of all historic greenhouse gas emissions Richard Heady has shown are tied back to 90 companies. And so what does that mean, right? And then you can see also in corporate and private actor interference in the negotiations, direct influence in the process, and so and direct blockage of certain elements in our frameworks and conventions. And so you have that on one hand, but then I think in the last decade or so, you've seen that companies are realizing that it's not just a risk. Climate doesn't just only pose a risk, but it's also a huge opportunity to really get ahead. I think that's why GM, for example, just recently said that they're going to start to manufacture all electric vehicles by 2030, because that it's not just good for the climate, but it's also a huge business opportunity. And so that's really where I think that a lot of this climate action on the corporate side, you have to take with a grain of salt, and why we're using data to try to understand what they are actually doing and how credible that action is. And I think the corporate climate action has particularly come under a lot of scrutiny with respect to these net zero pledges, because it's frankly likely not possible for every company, and we've recorded more than 1,500 have made a net zero pledge. It may not be possible given the fact that corporations are embedded in energy systems and electricity networks that are also not decarbonized for them to take on these pledges. And so many of them are investing in offsets that can be questionable and of variable quality. And so that also requires greater transparency. I mean, I think that from the policymakers' perspective, it's helpful to have large corporations going out there and making these bold claims, like Amazon, for example, is helping to drive, I think, a lot of other companies to do the same. We actually have a study that's using agent-based modeling to look at these corporate-to-corporate interactions and how they influence and get other corporations on board. But yeah, I mean, I think this is part of our job as citizens and as researchers to make sure that we hold these corporations and our city and local government leaders accountable for what they're pledging, because it's very easy to pledge. The follow-through is much more difficult. So I think it goes with every level of action. And so people also, they rightfully say, well, how can you know whether or not this is greenwashing? And I say, well, also same thing with national governments. We have no assurance through the Paris Agreement or any type of international mechanism that they're also following through. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I'm hoping that this is where the data piece can help to drive new forms of accountability.
Angel, on behalf of the whole audience, thank you so much for sharing your important research with us. We so much appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon, and perhaps even in person.
Yes, thank you so much. And I hope everyone stays safe, and I look forward to hearing from more people after this. So thank you so much for the invitation.